Hi! Today I wanted to talk about something that I consider very important for people to enjoy role playing games. There are a lot of people that think that they have been playing role playing games, but they are playing a sort of asking questions game that is quite unsatisfactory, in my opinion. It feels as if they are confusing the light of a small flame with the sun itself. There are so many more things, so much more to role playing games than just that, what I would consider an imperfect form. Now, this doesn't come from a place of arrogance. This is similar to, for example, maybe somebody tells you, I know how to play basketball. And you start to play, and the person starts running around with the basketball as if he or she were a football player, or they start to kick the basketball as if it was a game of soccer. So that's not how you play it. I think I have identified the exact disconnection between roleplay and a more imperfect way of carrying out the hobby. This has to do with the origins of Dungeons and Dragons, and we will talk about that in a few moments. Because I think in the origins of Dungeons and Dragons, therein lies the birth of roleplay, but also the distortion of roleplay. First, I wanted to give you a few examples, or perhaps a single example with some variations of how not to roleplay and how to roleplay. Imagine that the game master has two players. For the sake of simplicity, the game master is running a game for two players that are paying tribute to Fafard and the Grey Mouser, those beloved characters of sword and sorcery. Let's say that one character is kind of like the Grey Mouser, he's a rogue, let's call him Mouse. And the other warrior, instead of calling him Fafard, let's call him Tougher. So Mouse and Duffer, they are going to play in this adventure, participate in this adventure. So the game master starts telling them that in order for you to reach the Azure City, you need to cross the Swamp of Despair. And the game master describes what they are doing, not what they are going to do in that adventure, what they are, the beginning of the adventure. If the game master starts to describe everything that you start walking across the swamp and you see a wooden post, you approach the wooden post, you start to examine the wooden post to see if there are some writings or symbols or ruins, then that's the incorrect way of doing things. That either showcases a game master that is a frustrated player, that is a game master that wants to participate as a player character and is dictating the actions of the player characters, and that's incorrect. That's up to the players. And Shawn Driscoll, I'm going to put a link in to his channel in the description. He also mentioned that those sorts of game masters, they also look like frustrated storytellers or writers. They want to tell a story. They're just using the adventure as an excuse to tell their story, and they are not too interested in letting the players also shape the story. You should not tell the story just like that. The story is going to be told through the actions, the exploits, the failures, and the triumphs of the player characters and their interactions with the world, with the non-player characters, and such. So a correct way of doing things is just describing the scene and just let the player characters act. And you do not need to ask, what do you do? The typical question, what do you do? That creates a further disconnection. Shawn Driscoll also mentioned in another video that it feels kind of like those computer games, those adventure games where they are asking you like the questions, like a prompt, giving you a prompt, and then you type something down, those old school games, and it's not exactly a role-playing game experience. It's supposed to feel as an actual role-playing game, not as a video game in that sense. Because there are some role-playing games that try to simulate a video game, and that's fine, but this is not the case. So a better way of handling things is, like I said, just setting the scene, and now the player characters get the chance to act. An incorrect way of acting as a player character, or rather as a player, is asking questions to the game master or dungeon master or referee. An incorrect way of doing this would be maybe there is a lot of fog. There is a thick fog, and instead of trying to move carefully through the fog to see what the characters are finding in their path, the player asks the game master, "Can my character see anything through the fog? I don't know. Can you?" So instead of doing that, interact with the game world. Perhaps move carefully forwards, like say something like, "I'm going to proceed carefully." Perhaps you're pulling out your 10-foot pole. You say something like, "I'm pulling out my 10-foot pole," and I start sweeping around as I move forward, and I start to poke the ground because I don't want to fall into a quicksand sort of situation, or I don't want to trip and fall with something. And as you are moving the 10-foot pole, perhaps the game master will give you an automatic success because there is this vertical wooden pole, and your 10-foot pole or post bumps into it. So maybe that's an automatic success because of your cautious consideration or action. As a game master in those situations, it's always useful to make some rolls or to ask for a perception check just to get the players nervous. But in this case, I will tell you why it's further justified. So the game master could ask for a perception check, depending on the system that you are using, and without telling you if you found something or anything or whatever, the adventure proceeds, and he tells you, your 10-foot pole bumps into this vertical wooden post. And instead of the player, maybe it's a mouse, the sort of like a rogue character, instead of asking the dungeon master, is there anything written on the post, or is there any symbol on the post, you should do it like, I approach the post carefully and I start to look for markings or symbols on it. And then the game master could tell you, well, on a side of the post there is this small rune, and you recognize it. It's the Rune of Undeath. So now the player character, the player, can tell his partner, Topher, he can say something like, "Topher, halt! There are probably undead around here." And the gameplay proceeds, and the game master says, "Suddenly you see this shambling form. It appears to be a shambling corpse moving towards you at an alarming speed. It is dragging a rusty axe." And then the player characters decide what they want to do. Battle begins. They roll initiative. And like I said, some game masters actually start telling you, dictating to you what your characters are doing, that you charge the enemy and you're going to... No, let the player characters decide. Maybe they want to run away from that situation. Maybe they want to try to communicate with the creature. But let's say that this couple of adventurers decide to fight. They roll initiative, and it turns out that Topher is going to act first. And Topher decides to charge at the enemy. He's not going to ask the game master or dungeon master, "Can I charge the creature?" Just do it. Announce your intention. I'm going to charge against that enemy, against that creature. And the character starts to move, but because the fog is quite thick, the character didn't notice these tangled roots on the ground, and he's about to trip. The game master could ask for a saving throw or an ability check, and maybe the character is successful or not. But imagine if you were asking questions to the game master. Imagine if the player asked the game master, "Can I charge at the enemy?" And the game master is sure. And the character starts to charge, and he fails his check, and he trips and falls on the roots. And now he's going to blame the game master. "Oh, you told me that I could charge," but the game master didn't tell you that. It wasn't supposed to tell you that there were some hazards in that trajectory. A more cautious approach, because of the fog and the swampy environment, would have been to proceed at normal speed against the enemy. That way, because you were walking at your normal speed, you wouldn't have tripped on those roots. So it's all about that. Have you tried running in a very swampy, slippery area? It's very difficult. You can easily slip and fall. So it's all about that realism, that logic within the fiction. And now the player character swings his two-handed sword vertically. He wants to, if possible, split the zombie, the shambling corpse, in half. The game master asks for both the attack and damage roll to save some time, and he rolls his d20 and his, let's say, his d10, or depending on the system, the die that you use for the two-handed sword. And then, oh, I scored an 18 and 7 damage. And maybe that's enough to hit the creature. And the game master says, yes, your sword dug partially into the enemy, but it feels so hard. It's as if you are trying to hack your way into a solid wooden door. And that way, again, if the player was asking a question like, can I attack the enemy? Maybe the game master obviously would say, you can attack the enemy. Unnecessary, a waste of time, pulling you out from the situation, from the immersion. And the blow was not exactly as effective because of the unnatural sturdiness of the creature. And now the player could complain that the game master pointed out that he could attack the creature, yes, but maybe that creature has some sort of magical protection or defense. So it's all about that. And many people play role-playing games with all of those questions, unnecessary questions that pull you out of the experience. Instead of interacting, announcing what you are going to do with your player character, I'm going to do this, I'm going to attack, I'm going to check that wall. Maybe there is some painting on the wall, like a mural, and there is a door. Instead of asking, painted on the wall, instead of asking, oh, is there a keyhole in that painted door? Because maybe you suspect that it's actually not a painting, it's an actual door. Instead of doing that, try to poke the painting with your fingers, or if you're cautious or worried about traps or anything, start to poke it with your 10-foot pole, or cast perhaps a spell to see if something is revealed. It all depends on your resources, on your mundane tools, your magical items, your abilities as a player character, depending on the system, and so forth. Now let's talk about where this disconnection happened. And just to solidify things further, it's all about interacting with the world. The game master doesn't exist, let's put it like that. The characters in the game world exist. The environments, the castles, the ruins, the swamps, any sort of creature, the traps, everything that you want to do it through the game world. And you will be pulled into the experience. You will start to live the adventure. Instead of just playing this sort of like a social, distorted experience where you're constantly making jokes that have nothing to do with the game. You're constantly laughing at your ineptitude of how things are proceeding. Perhaps you feel too much pressure because of how things are developing. This is especially true of horror role-playing games. The players start to feel very scared. In fact, the first players that make jokes in horror role-playing games are quite obviously afraid of the adventure, and they want to distance themselves from the adventure. And it doesn't have to be a horror situation. It could be your average RPG adventure, but for some reason they feel too intense. The way that the game pulls them into the fictional world, they just want to distance themselves from that. So just try it. Try to play an RPG session, staying in character, staying within the game world all the time. If you find something funny, laugh as your character. Don't laugh as, oh, I'm Bob, and oh, that's so funny. No, you're playing as Trankar, the Invincible, and no, and everybody starts to reinforce that fictional reality. Okay, now about the disconnection. I think this has its origins in the very birth of Dungeons and Dragons. Specifically, the differences or clash of styles between Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. Because Gary Gygax had a lot to do with landing the idea of Dungeons and Dragons and marketing Dungeons and Dragons, there are some people that do not know that Dave Arneson actually came up with the concept of Dungeons and Dragons. Gary was just there to make that vision a reality. So, for those of you that do not know, Gary Gygax created Chainmail, a set of wargame rules, more like skirmish rules, you could say. And Dave Arneson took this system and for his own enjoyment with his group, he started to modify many things about it. That's how the Blackmoor campaign setting was born. He started to get his players into these personal adventures within Castle Blackmoor. It was not about controlling units of soldiers or armies. It was about an individual character that became more powerful as time went by. If that character was lucky enough to survive, that character would grow in several ways. And the whole concept of going into dark places, into dungeons, that was also Dave Arneson's idea. The players explored the totality of Castle Blackmoor. So he decided to keep things within the castle, but because everything was explored, he started to build downwards. Instead of adding floors to the castle, which would be quite illogical, although I think it would have been within a fantasy context. Maybe there are some portals at the top of the tower that take you to a hidden floor above in the castle. Maybe that would have been a good idea, don't you think? But they've decided to build this dungeon complex underneath Castle Blackmoor. And so that's how the entire concept of Dungeons and Dragons started to take shape. It was born. But there were some differences. His players played as the adventurers, but all other players also played as the villains. So imagine if you are running Curse of Strahd, and some players would be like the fighter, the wizard, the cleric, and you had another player controlling Strahd, and you were the game master, the dungeon master running things, but other players would be the villains. So he started to run those adventures like that. Dave Arneson, I am fully convinced that I never played with him, and I don't think I've ever seen a game that Arneson ran, but I have read posts, books, watched videos where they talk how Arneson ran Dungeons and Dragons, or rather the birth Blackmoor, the Blackmoor campaign, because it's pretty much early Dungeons and Dragons, and he really put emphasis on role-playing. He wanted the players to be so immersed that he would do things like, he would tell the players, come step with me into this other part of the basement. It was like a more cramped area of the basement, and they took places as their characters in the marching order, and Dave started to describe how they were walking through this dark corridor, and suddenly he turned off the lights because the mysterious wind blew off their torches. They had no light whatsoever, and now they were in complete darkness. And suddenly Dave Arneson yelled. He screamed at the top of his lungs, and everybody, like, they got a bit unnerved, and they shuffled a bit. They changed their places, and he said, "Stop!" And that's how your characters are going to begin this combat round in the places in which you are, because it was obviously a monster, and because the players in real life, they got a bit scared because of the yell. They moved their positions, and now that's how they are going to start the battle. Obviously, that was a one trick pony sort of situation, or something that you could not repeat, because the players would always be expecting for Dave Arneson to yell at them if they were taken into a dark place. But it was very cool for that very specific occasion. That's a great way of running the combat encounter and getting the players fully into the experience. That's when they went back to the table, as I remember correctly, to make those the rolls. Now, Gary Gygax became aware of Dave Arneson's heavy modifications to chainmail. So he asked Dave Arneson to run a game, a Blackmoor game, for him and his group. And Dave Arneson traveled with David Megary, the one who created the Dungeon board game. Back then it was called Pasha Kada. They went to Gary Gygax's house, and the players were assisted by Dave Megary. He would also participate as an adventurer, but he would be there to guide Gary Gygax and Rob Kuntz and I think other people into Blackmoor. Dave Arneson normally would have other players to play the roles of the villains, but because Gary Gygax's group was not experienced in his way of running things, he had to control all of the monsters and non-player characters himself. That's how that responsibility of the Dungeon Master was born, because Dave Arneson didn't have players to control the antagonists. And it was a complete success. They had a blast. Gary Gygax had never played something like that before. And nobody knew how the rules exactly worked. Dave Arneson was so good at it that he didn't explain anything about the system. He only asked he was telling the situation, describing the situation, and the players were telling him what they were doing. And so he told them, like, make this roll, do this check, and then he saw the result, and without telling them, he described what happened, if the attack was a success, if they found a hidden passage, etc. So it was pure roleplay, to the point that you could take a group without telling them anything about the system, and just by indicating when they should be making those rolls, that's how things moved forward. So Gary Gygax was very impressed. Eventually, Arneson and Megary had to return to their homes. But Gary Gygax already had this idea of selling this experience. It wasn't Dungeons and Dragons yet. It was the Blackmoor campaign, and later on it turned into a draft by Gary Gygax. But he met with failure as he asked Rob Kuntz to run a game for him. They didn't know anything about Dave Arneson's game besides that initial Blackmoor experience. So Gary Gygax participated as an adventurer, and Rob Kuntz would be like the dungeon master. They attempted to run a wilderness adventure, but they failed. They were bored. It was a catastrophe. Gary Gygax couldn't identify what was it that made Arneson's game such a success, the way that he ran things. He started to talk with Arneson, many phone calls, exchanging letters, but he couldn't figure it out. He eventually asked Arneson if he could send him his notes, his manuals and such. And here's the thing with Dave Arneson. He is brilliant. He was brilliant when it comes to running an RPG. But when it comes to rules, it was a complete mess. He didn't have a proper structured, robust system. Everything was changed from one moment to the next. During the first encounter, he decided to handle this attack as an ability check. The next encounter, he decides that it's going to be a saving throw. In another encounter, it's a random roll depending on the context of the instance. So he was constantly changing everything. He sent Gary Gygax this mess that were just a bunch of tables and notes and scribbled like indications, but it wasn't a proper RPG manual. So it was up to Gary Gygax he understood that people weren't going to play something that they didn't properly understand as a structured rule set. So it was up to Gary Gygax to give all of that some form or shape, and that's how the basic or the earliest Dungeons and Dragons system was born, and it has withstood the test of time. It's an effective system. Some people may not like it, but there is a way to resolve combat, different sort of skill check situations, the Vancian spells and magic. That's why we still use it even to this day. But as I see it, the way that I see it, I don't think Gary Gygax ever understood the proper way of playing role-playing games, because he and his entire group, they all had that sort of what do you do, ask questions sort of mentality. I talked about I talked about this in another video where I mentioned that this member of the Gygax inner circle, I'm not going to say his name because, well, not only is he still alive and producing content, so it's not an attack against him. I think he brought some contributions to Dungeons and Dragons, important contributions, perhaps even crucial. The way that he runs things, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? And then the players say what they are doing. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? It's always like, and they ask questions all the time. So it's a complete mess. So it is my understanding that Gygax and friends never understood how to roleplay. And because they were the ones who were writing the books, the expansions, the supplements, we're talking early Dungeons and Dragons, they were instructing players through their books how to play a game that wasn't a role-playing game at all. So it's a shame that Gary and Arneson, they clashed. They didn't get along later on because of some disputes related to the royalties and of Dungeons and Dragons, crediting Arneson as the creator of Dungeons and Dragons. People are more familiar with Gary Gygax, but he only gave shape to the original Arneson idea. This is not to say that Gary Gygax didn't have any sort of gaming cred or fantasy reputation or cred, or, you know, Gary Gygax was probably one of the more informed people when it comes to sword and sorcery, fantasy. He read all of the classics, and he was a wargamer, so he knew about games, he knew about fantasy, but in my opinion he didn't know about roleplay. So I think that's where the disconnection happened. I think that the true essence of role-playing games was transmitted through Dave Arneson, the people that played with Dave Arneson and later on played Gygax's version of Dungeons and Dragons, implementing the original Arneson spirit. So yes, I hope this video was informative, perhaps helpful. Stop asking questions to the game master. There could be some games that have mechanics that rewrite the past, that have some sort of metagaming elements, and it's fine to play those mechanics if you enjoy them. But beyond that, interact with the non-player characters, with the game world. If you want to know something about the game world, ask a non-player character. Or experiment with the objects, the furniture, the surfaces of anything that you encounter. Do you want to know if something is hot or cold, or just touch it? Let your five senses assist you in everything. You want to know how something smells, approach that thing and start to sniff to see, or do you want to know if there is something around the corner? Don't ask the game master. Describe how you carefully approach the corner. Perhaps at first you like poke your sword around the corner just to see if something is going to attack it, or, you know, the typical, you put a hat or a helmet on a stick and you start to push it around the corner and to see if a monster attacks so that you are not hurt. You could describe that, or use a spell to see if you want to check the contents of a certain room or a chest. Maybe you have a spell that allows you to, gives you like an X-ray or like a vision effect, and you can see what's behind that wall or inside of the chest. Use your creativity. Otherwise, you're playing role-playing games like with training wheels, like in kiddie mode. Because you're going to be like, oh, I don't want my character to die, so please, please, Mr. Dungeon Master, tell me if there is a trap in that door, or if there is a trap in that chest. That's a very unsatisfactory way of playing, in my opinion. Be intelligent and bold at the same time. As in courageous, brave, but with intelligence. Like those heroes. Or if you are playing as a cowardly player character, be a coward within the game. Don't be a coward as a player. Well, thank you for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.